Yeah, great. So you are Roshi of this place, of the monastery, or...
We have as a practice center. We don't have a monastery here. Maybe someday, but now we don't. We're a city center.
Yeah, great. So I am part of spiritual community in Russia. We mainly follow fourth way, if you know who is Gurdjieff.
Gurdjieff, yes.
Yeah, but we are really interested in Zen and enlightenment and Kensho. So I will be pleased if you can answer my questions about that.
I'll try.
Okay, great. So can we begin with your story? Like, can you give me your story? How did you come to Zen? What was your path?
Well, this is a long, I'm old, so it's a long story. I was born in a Jewish family, and my father thought religion was for weak-minded people, be it of the masses. So in spite of that, I entered a Orthodox synagogue when I was young, very young, and was quite interested in religion from a very early age, in spite of my family. And then in my bar mitzvah, I was trained by the rabbi, and I led the entire service reading from the Torah. When I was reading from the Torah, holding the silver pointer, I looked up into the eternal light and into the light that is always kept glowing. And I disappeared into that light, and I became light. Yeah, I don't know how long I was gone. It seemed an eternity. And then when I came back, I was still standing there reading. And then I went to make my speech to the congregation. And I looked at the congregation and I thought, I don't belong here anymore. So I went away looking for something that was congruent with that experience that I had had there. My self became light. And then when I looked at the community, it was as though they had traded individual ego for a big group ego. And I didn't feel I belonged there anymore. Now, that's not to say I ever gave up my Jewish identity as a culture, but as a religion of one God and one people, I couldn't follow that anymore. The other part of it, I guess, was my father had a lot of ups and downs in his career. And I watched him being emotionally bounced around from happiness to great despair. And I pledged to myself I'd find a way not to have to go through those extremes in my life. So in those days, this was in the 50s, 1950s, there wasn't very much available.
Where it was?
The 1955.
I am asking, where is it? United States? Yeah, where?
In Colorado.
In Colorado.
Yeah, U.S. Colorado. So I read books on yoga and started meditating when I was about 13 years old. But I meditated in the closet so my parents wouldn't find me meditating, and started practicing yoga asanas and read about Buddhism and so forth. But then I kind of put it aside and went to college. I went to college in the East Coast at Yale in Connecticut. And after 2 years, I decided I really wanted to live life rather than study life. And so I joined the Peace Corps and I went to India. And in India, India was very transformative for me completely. One thing I learned in India, well, we were taught that the caste system was a very horrible thing. And yet, I was in a very rural village all by myself, and the caste system was quite operative. What I learned was like my close friend was a tailor, and his son would become a tailor. He didn't have an option to become a rich person. Well, he could be you can't be a really rich tailor in India, but there was no limit to the amount he could work on his virtue, on his spiritual practice. So instead of everybody thinking about how to get ahead financially or materially, they thought about how to get ahead spiritually and in terms of their own virtue. And I found that very moving. And when I came back, I went back to college, and I went into graduate school and studied Sanskrit to read the Vedas. And when I finished reading the Vedas, then I left and decided I would be a poet, because the Vedas are poetry, and poetry is very powerful. I started painting and writing poetry and selling them on the street in San Francisco. And where I was living with a friend of mine, I met Suzuki Roshi, Suzuki Roshi. He was living, his place was very close to where I was living. So I started sitting with him in 1969. And that was my first introduction to Buddhism. And you might say I fell in love with Suzuki Roshi. He was such a wonderful presence. And after a year, I married and went on a retreat with my wife in a very remote area of California. And after a year of that, I was sitting 10, 12 hours a day. I got very, very confused. And so I went to Tassajara to meet with Suzuki Roshi, and found out in that time he had died. And sat down and in the office, and there was a book by Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche called Cutting Through Spiritual Materialism. And somehow that book spoke to me as Roshi had spoken to me. And so we went looking for Trungpa Rinpoche, and eventually, through a long roundabout way, I found him in Vermont, and in his office. I told him I'd been sitting there, and I was so lonely and so by myself that I took a statue of the Buddha and put him on a cushion next to me, so I had somebody to sit with. And I said, "Is there no end to this loneliness, this aloneness, this isolation?" He says, "No, I'm afraid not. Goodbye." And so I was very, very upset and left. And he sent someone to find me and invited me to stay and stay with him in Vermont. So we moved nearby there, and I studied with Trungpa Rinpoche in Tibetan Buddhism, in Kagyupa. And he, with Suzuki Roshi, had decided to do two things together. One was to start a mental health institute. Many of the people that came to them were not really able to practice Buddhism, but instead were too crazy. So they wanted to establish a place where people could become healthy enough to begin to practice. And the other thing they wanted to do together was to start a Buddhist university. So when Suzuki Roshi died, Trungpa Rinpoche decided he would do both of those for Suzuki Roshi. And he started Naropa. It was called Naropa Institute in Boulder. And so I, together with Trungpa, moved to Boulder in 1974. And he started Naropa. And that summer, I was living in a house with 5 other practitioners. One of them was in charge of all of the priests and clergy that were invited. And we had a party the first night of Naropa, and Kobanchino Roshi came, and I looked at him, he looked at me, we were like brothers or something, and we became very, very, very close. So I started studying Zen then with him again, kind of like finding my old roots again. I went to Trungpa Rinpoche. I said, well, this is pretty strange. Can I do both Tibetan and... Because Trungpa Rinpoche was, in those days, Americans were shoppers. You know, which religion is good for me? You know, where do I belong? Blah, 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 blah. Still goes that way. But so he very much discouraged that. He said, you know, find one thing and stick with that. Don't deviate, otherwise you'll never go anywhere. So I went to Trungpa and asked him, he says, well, you have two grandmothers, don't you? And I said, yes. He said, do you get them confused? I said, no. He said, well, you won't get these confused either. So I've practiced both. I still practice both my whole life. But Trungpa died in 1987. And my connection to that entire lineage was through him. And I didn't find any connection to his successors at all. So I've fallen away from, I don't have a teacher in that lineage anymore. I've continued to study with Trungpa Rinpoche and Tralag Rinpoche and a few others, but essentially, my training has been in Zen since Trungpa Rinpoche died. And Kobun started a community eventually in New Mexico in the early 80s. And I moved there to Taos in 1986 to be part of that community and help with that establishment called Hokoji. And so I lived next door to Kobun, and he ordained me. In a funny way, once my wife and I were having a terrible time, and we were about to break up, and he shows up at the door, even though he lives in New Mexico, in Boulder. He says, oh, I've been waiting for this to happen, and he shaved my head and put the robes on me and sent me to Japan to study with his brother. So I became a monk then and studied with his elder brother. His older brother then ordained me in Japan, and he became my Zen master. That made Kobun and I like brothers. So I was very, very close to Kobun, and also to his older brother. I became like a family person, member of the family. But my training was mostly, formal training in Zen was in Japan. The deep training was with Kobun. So I acknowledge both of them as my lineage here, part of it. Then in 10 years after that, I had my Hosenshiki, which is the second stage of Zen training. It's kind of like a PhD examination, where in Japan I had about 40 monks come from all over the country to question me. And two rows of people line up, and you're at one end. They brought me a stick, and they said, this stick comes from Shakyamuni Buddha, and they will help you in your answers. So I grab onto the stick, I hope so. And most of them were very curious about how I could imagine Buddhism could happen in America. Because the Japanese at that time, they've changed now, but they didn't believe that Buddhism could happen in the West. Now I understand why I didn't at that time. But so I did that there, and then 10 years after that, I got the final Dharma Transmission, which is it comes from the original encounter between Shakyamuni and Mahakashyapa, where Buddha holds up a flower and Mahakashyapa smiles. And that is the ultimate transmission. That's what Zen comes from. So the transmission is a reenactment in a sense of that. It's also a blood-to-blood exchange. You cut yourself and merge your blood with your teacher. It took a long time, the whole thing.
one question. Which language did you speak in Japan? Are you still speaking English, or you?
English. Yeah, I still struggle with Japanese a lot. Although Kobun's elder brother, his name is Kebun, was fantastic with language. So one year when I went there, he says, "Parlez-vous français?" He says, "Let's only speak in French this time." And so we spoke only in French. But a lot of Zen doesn't require much language. A lot of it's very physical, very energetic connection with people, what to do. And there's a lot of sitting, which is very quiet. So then the most recent one is I went back. The Japanese don't recognize teachers outside of Japan. So I went back to Japan last year for 7 months in monastery with Dojo Roshi, another Suzuki Roshi, and the main teacher was Suzuki Roshi, Shunryu Suzuki Roshi's son, who's now 81 years old. So we had a lot of fun together. I don't think he knows anybody that knew his father. And then I got now I'm a registered Soto teacher and Osho ranking, and Hakubai, the temple here, is part of the Soto world. So that's the story, more or less.
Okay. You didn't mention your enlightenment experience while you're telling me this story, but I suppose you had probably a lot of such experience, aren't you?
Well, enlightenment is a word that doesn't have a conceptual correlate. I had a lot of insights as going along. Yeah. I don't know about enlightenment experience. I'm not enlightened.
How do you know that? How do you know that you are not enlightened?
Well, because for one thing, if you know you're enlightened, you're certainly not enlightened.